This screencast is going to give a brief overview of major language learning approaches. So a hypothesis is sort of the smallest unit we're going to talk about today. It makes a prediction, and researchers test hypotheses, oddly, to disprove them. The research results can support, but it cannot prove a hypothesis, but it can certainly challenge a hypothesis. And all together, with lots of results of lots of different hypotheses, it might support or challenge the whole underlying theory. So a theory can be defined as a set of statements about natural phenomenon that explains why these occur. They should be accurate, consistent, have a broad scope, but yet simple. So we want it to cover lots of accurately and consistently describe the phenomenon and the whole phenomenon, but we don't want it to have lots of exceptions, like these are strong verbs, these are weak verbs, and so different things are happening. And we want it to be fruitful. We want the theory to have applications that are useful. In language learning, perhaps we would want to say, does it help us come up with effective language learning methodology or language teaching methodology, and would it also be efficient? Can we help the process along? Since there's lots of different theories and lots of different hypotheses, I'm going to suggest that it might be helpful to use a slightly broader term of a framework or an approach to kind of organize our thoughts. So, for instance, an approach is a slightly larger term, might have a theory and lots of several hypotheses within there, but it might also be grouped together with another theory and its related hypotheses. So we're going to use the word approach as slightly bigger than theory, and this will help us group together all the several of the ideas that we will be discussing. So here are the 5 major ones that I'm grouping for this at one grouping. These are my ideas. So let's go over each one. So as structuralists, at that time, the linguists focused on the structure, the forms of the language, not just like being the form connected to the concept of cat, but also the structure of how clauses and phrases are put together. And it came up, this is where we have the contrastive analysis hypothesis with its hierarchy of difficulty of if something's happening in one language and it's different in the other language, will that be easier or harder to learn? And also the idea of error analysis. We can look at the structure, the form of what was produced, and that will tell us a lot about language learning and how to help the learner. At this time, behaviorism was the dominant learning theory. And so when behaviorism was applied to language learning, we've got the audiolingual method, where we're going to focus, say the exact same structure many times to have that set structure at our disposal, and we're going to practice it exactly. We're going to focus on that form, and we're going to repeat that because behaviorism, we want to get practice, lots of practice. Now, on sort of the other opposite side is the nativists, or sometimes called innateists, with the idea of universal grammar, which is abbreviated UG. And this has the idea that there is a language acquisition device. Language learning is so much more complicated than behaviorism can explain, and language is so complicated, we must have an innate, endowed ability to learn language as humans. And the focus is on the ideal speaker, what their competence, not their performance. So all those little mistakes that you might hear me making. They're not interested in that. They're not interested in the actual speech, just what I know about the language. And there's also no consideration of social aspects of learning or the social aspects of language. Here we had the input hypothesis. We're just going to get lots of hear and see lots of the target language that was refined to comprehensible input. It's not enough just to hear the language. We have to have something to be able to figure out what the different words might mean. The affect filter and the natural order hypothesis. If it's a universal grammar and we as humans have this language acquisition device, once we're exposed to the language, we'll all learn it in basically the same way. It's a natural order. And so we can teach language with just a natural approach, just like we did our first language. The next one we're going to talk about is the cognitive approach, and this is real important. I have found it very useful to think of it very much like your mind is a computer. We have information, we're going to process it, and that's going to be how we learn. We have automatic and controlled processing, declarative knowledge, and procedural knowledge. Some things that we know how to explain it, and some things we know how to do it. We can learn explicitly. We can be told what the information is, or we can be exposed to the information and we can pick it up without directly stating it. But our mind, being the computer, can get lots of those examples, and then without us having, sort of subconsciously, we'll understand the information without ever being told it. I would put the idea of interlanguage under the umbrella of cognition because it focuses on the individual and their understanding. But other approaches also consider the interlanguage to be extremely important data to study to understand language learning. So the next one is informed by both cognitive and the structuralists, as well as the sociocultural theory. So this one is sort of just mushed together as cognitive plus interaction. Some of the recent terms is emergentism and usage-based approaches, with the idea of perceptual salience. Although we all have a mind and we are exposed to the language, some things might stick out to us more and we'll learn that quicker. It's not just a computer. There's also something else happening. Here I've put the interaction hypothesis, comprehensible output hypothesis, and noticing hypothesis, because in all of these, the focus is on the learner and what the learner, say, can notice. But mostly what we as a learner notice is during an interaction. So we're working to learn the language actively, using our minds cognitively, but we realize what we don't yet know by often in interaction, or when we go to produce something in the target language, we might realize we don't yet have all the information needed to successfully communicate in the target language. And then the last broad learning approach is sociocultural, which is well known in general learning with Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development and how we can scaffold learning. And the idea of communicative language teaching is most closely tied with this, because oftentimes in communicative language learning activities, the idea is to accomplish the task. It doesn't quite matter what the structure you use. Use whatever you can at your disposal because we want to communicate. So the focus is more on having effective communication. So this screencast shows how I understand these theories, and I have categorized them into 5 major groups, but other groupings are certainly possible. And in reality, the categories are not clear-cut. As we noticed, what I labeled cognitive plus interaction is actually taking bits of structuralists, behaviorists, cognitive, and sociocultural. So sometimes it's a bit of a gray area, and there might be some overlap. I hope that the framework, this way to understand them into 5 groups, albeit with some overlap and gray area, it will be helpful to organize our thoughts and on the discussion.